entire city down to minimum wage, $7.25 an hour. Firefighters, police, teachers, everybody on the city payroll, their pay was cut to minimum wage. NBC News does a story, they have reporters there, everyone's saying, interviewing the mayor, and he's saying, I don't know, we just don't have enough money, we have to do this, we have no choice, it's budget cuts, etc., etc. Okay? In Stockton, California, after the 2008 housing crash, the entire economy basically exploded. They're now in bankruptcy. The city has cut 25% of its police force, 30% of its fire department, and over 40% of all city employees. And now the city is considering cutting a pension for its retirees in order to make the creditors happy in its bankruptcy filing. So that's another example. In New York City, our transit system is seriously in debt. Since 2010, 300 bus lines have been cut, 2 subway lines have been cut. This affects the poorest New Yorkers, people of color, immigrants, working class folks trying to get to work, people who don't have cars. There have been mass layoffs, okay? In Boston has the most indebted transportation system in the country. The finances are so dire that officials in Boston are threatening to cut subway, train, and bus service by 43% to save money. It affects almost everyone, right, who rides public transportation. So we have to ask what's going on here. Why are the budgets being cut? Why is this financial crisis happening? And really what it is like we have what they call a post-Keynesian economy where we don't publicly fund municipalities anymore. The federal government doesn't fund them. The public is very averse to raising taxes. So instead of a publicly financed municipalities, we have debt-financed municipalities. So what happens is municipalities now, one of the only funding sources they have is through the issuance of municipal bonds. So what they do is a municipality, which could be a city, state in some cases, or a town, or even like a small development district within a town, can issue a bond. And the banks buy these bonds. And then the bondholder, which would be like JP Chase, right, then lends the issuer money. You sell me a bond and I will give you $100 million to build your sewer, right? And in exchange for that cash up front, I'm going to pay, from the municipality, I have to pay the bond buyer interest for the life of the loan. And eventually the principal will come due. Also, the interest rates on these bonds can be fixed or variable, just like in the housing market. So there's a lot that's similar there as well. The municipal debt story actually began in New York City. There was a fiscal crisis in the 1970s. And what happened is, in order to get out of that mess, the city used pension funds to back loans from Wall Street. So this idea that we just borrow our way out of fiscal crises and keep kicking the can down the road, you could trace it back to New York City fiscal crisis. So one of the things that we're starting to talk about in the Strike Debt campaign, which I'm a part of and which produced this manual, is the debt is a system. It's a primary mechanism by which wealth is extracted from communities all around the country. And municipal debt is certainly one way to do that. Also, municipal debt is very profitable for people. They make debt on top of the debt. So eventually somebody has to pay these bonds, though. They do come due. And that's always the 99%. It's always the people. So that's what we have in places like Scranton and Stockton, California, and New York City and Boston is American austerity, which is service cuts, layoffs, and wage cuts in order to try to make these payments to bankers. What happened in Scranton, in fact, was it threatened to default on one of these bonds. Its parking authority owed several $100 million to Wall Street, and it threatened to default because it didn't have the money. Wall Street came down with an iron fist, cut off the city's access to credit markets, and it could no longer pay its debts because in a debt-financed economy, credit is the only way to pay for anything. Another example that we can talk about is with Jefferson County, Alabama, which in 2011 filed what was at that time the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. They had a $4 billion debt. Most of it was for a sewer system. So officials in Jefferson County borrowed billions from Wall Street to repair the sewer. They were corrupt. They, peddled contracts to their cronies in the government. Long story. 17 city officials were eventually jailed. The sewer was never built, and so the sewage is still being dumped into that river. But JP Chase doesn't care. JP Chase purchased the bonds that were initially used to fund these contracts, and they came in and demanded their payment. They want their money. They don't care 2002, the New York City transit system subways wanted to begin what it called its capital projects, expansions and repairs. It didn't have the money, and it wasn't going to get the money from the state. And so Bear Stearns, the investment firm, helpfully offered to help the MTA restructure their debt. And what restructuring in that case just meant is that they were going to extend the life, they were going to give them a loan and extend the life of the loan so that the interest rates, so that eventually you end up paying more than what you already end up, because they, like, if you owe $50,000 and you're going to pay it in a month, you extend it to 6 months, you're going to end up paying a lot more. And that's what Bear Stearns suggested that the MTA do, and they did. The other thing that the MTA did is they signed a contract for one of these interest rate swaps with JP Morgan Chase. And so then when the economy blew up and interest rates crashed after 2008, the city is now paying about $115 million per year to JP Morgan Chase that they just flushed down the toilet because of these interest rate swaps that JP Morgan Chase insists on not letting the city out of. In Boston, they're so in debt in Boston that 33 cents of every dollar spent on public transportation goes to pay interest on the debt.
Wow.
Other cities whose transportation is debt financed: Baton Rouge, Boston, Charlotte, Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, New York, Philadelphia, San Francisco, San Jose, Washington, D.C. All these systems are essentially in the same boat. In order to pay these debts, the cities often sell off their assets. So it's privatization. In Chicago, the Skyway Toll Road, which is a 7-mile stretch of highway, has been leased to a private company, so that company can collect tolls on that road.
Wow.
For the next 99 years. That road has been sold to a private company. The city of Atlanta privatized its water supply in the 90s to pay its debts to Wall Street. It eventually did cancel the contract at great expense because the water was tainted. We should also, since we're here, we have to talk about the World Trade Center. World Trade Center site is basically owned by multinational banks. It was largely constructed partly through insurance, but it was also constructed through what they called Liberty bonds, right? Liberty, where multinational banks would basically fund the construction of the buildings to replace the ones that were that fell down after the terrorist attacks. So, just to give you an example, Goldman Sachs needed a new headquarters. So they provided the funding to build their 40-story tower right across from the old World Trade Center site. And it cost about $3 billion. And then right when they were getting to the end of the process, Goldman Sachs kind of started to back off a little bit, and they said, wait a minute, actually we're not sure we want to move in. We've profited already from building this office, and now we don't want to move in. And the city got really scared because they need Goldman Sachs to, for some reason, they want Goldman Sachs to be located in Lower Manhattan. So after Goldman Sachs had already profited from the building of its own office in Lower Manhattan through bonds, the city then gave them over $100 million of cash and public subsidies to then finally agree to move into the building that they had been financing. The thing with Goldman Sachs is they're the most profitable they're the most profitable firm in Wall Street history, and one of the most profitable companies in the world. They could have paid for the entire office and the entire infrastructure themselves for what they earn in about 2 months. So they don't need any public subsidies, but yet they received hundreds of millions of dollars. It's very hard to get out of these municipal bond transactions. In many cases, federal bankruptcy codes guarantee that creditors will be paid no matter what. Orange County, California declared bankruptcy in the 90s. Through negotiations with the courts, all the creditors ended up being paid. In fact, they got more money than they were actually owed, because Orange County was so afraid of pissing off Wall Street that they actually gave them more money in the end, because they wanted to stay in good graces with the banks, since debt is the only way they can finance their basic operations. So since 2008, New York State has in fact paid $243 million to terminate municipal bond deals with Wall Street. So they paid $243 million to get out of these deals. $191 million of that was financed by new debt. So we are borrowing money, paying down, we're taking on new debt to pay down old debt. Somehow this makes sense to them. But you know, when you start to read about this stuff, what you see is that if you're a student and you take out a loan or you buy something on a credit card, like that's debt. It's the whole definition of debt changes. Like to these guys, their debt is not debt. Our debt is debt. Their debt doesn't count as debt, right? Illinois is one of the worst offenders. Chicago is completely debt financed, that city. And there's a whole thing with the teacher strike that I could go into. I think that's all really just about municipal debt. But for example, and this goes to the idea of like what debt is and how we define it. In 2011, the governor of Illinois issued $8 billion in public debt through bonds to pay the interest on debts already on the books. So he issued new debt to pay down the debt. And when he did that, he said, this is not new borrowing. So to them, when you take out debt to pay new debt, that's not debt. Because they get to say what debt is. We don't. They do. So the next question is like, what can we do about this? It's a very obscure thing. It's kind of technical. You know, it's huge. It's about a $3.7 trillion market. It affects almost every municipality in the country. We're all debtors to Wall Street when it comes to municipal debt, but there have been some actions that we can look to for inspiration. In Brooklyn, where I live, a few blocks from my apartment, the new arena for the Brooklyn Nets basketball team was built partially on land that was condemned before being transferred to developers, and municipal bonds were part of the funding. And community activists in Brooklyn delayed the construction of this arena for years. You know, it's obviously they didn't win in the end, but they delayed the construction for years and were able to point out some of the problems with the financing of the arena. In Scranton, which I mentioned at the beginning, the municipal unions actually sued the city, and they won, and their wages were restored earlier this summer. Baltimore is suing more than a dozen big banks for manipulating LIBOR, which is the benchmark for many interest rates on financial products. The LIBOR interest rate is very, very important when it comes to municipal debt because the interest rates, many of them are pegged to LIBOR. So when Wall Street manipulates the interest rate, they're essentially stealing from every city, town, village, municipality in the country. In fact, there's a big article in Rolling Stone a couple months ago by Matt Taibbi about municipal bond rigging, and he calls it the scam Wall Street learned from the mafia, which is basically Wall Street, you know, stealing a little bit from every single person in America, and that's their business model. And they do that through municipal bond rigging. So you can read about that in Rolling Stone. It's fascinating. In July, and this is more activist stuff, a group called the Boston Fair Strike declared a free fare day and held turnstiles open in the subway to protest fare hikes and protest Wall Street's vice grip on their city's transportation.